This is episode 64 of Ethics and Culture Cast from the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture. Welcome to episode 64 of Ethics and Culture Cast from Notre Dame's DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture. I'm Ken Hellenius, the communications specialist at the center. In this episode, recorded during the Center's 21st Annual Fall Conference, we chat with Father Matthew Schneider, a priest of the Legionaries of Christ who is writing a dissertation on issues of privacy in the modern age. We chat about how the Church engages secular thinkers on these important questions and how he has used social media as a channel of evangelization. Let's sit down together for this fascinating conversation. Well, Father Matthew Schneider, thank you so much for coming to be with us on the podcast.
It's great to be here, Ken.
Well, so tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? Where did you do your studies? Kind of those sorts of things.
So I'm originally from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I grew up there. My whole family still lives there. In 2001, I started feeling a call to the priesthood and listening to John Paul II and things, and that led me to join the Legion that year. And then I've studied around the world with the Legion. I did some studies here in the States. And I did, for my theology, I did the bachelor's degree in Rome. Then I did what's called an STL, which is kind of like between a master's and doctoral degree. Mm-hmm. Like in Rome, I did STB, which is kind of equivalent to an MDiv, what most priests get here in the States. Then I did the STL at Sacred Heart in Detroit. And now I'm doing my doctoral degree in sacred theology back in Rome at Regina Apostolorum, which is the institution the Legionaries run. And my director for that is Father Nicanor Austriaco out in Providence College. So,
Father Nick is he's a faculty member of our Vita Institute and a friend of the center. So that's delightful.
Oh, definitely. He's a great professor. It was interesting because originally the thesis was bioethics, moral theology, kind of on the borderline. And at one point in the process, it definitely made a step more into moral theology, which, whereas he's more of bioethics, even though he has a doctorate degree in moral theology, most of what he does is bioethics because he also has the degree in microbiology.
Right.
But he's directing it through Rome. So.
Well, so what are you writing about? What is your dissertation?
So my dissertation is on informational privacy. I think that we need to distinguish in U.S. law because we talk about the right to privacy in two senses in U.S. law. And one sense is kind of a decisional privacy that isn't really privacy in the ordinary sense we think of it. And that's where you have things like the right to abortion or the right to homosexual marriage and that whole homosexual marriage shows that it's really not about privacy, but it's some kind of like free will, liberty right that the U.S. Constitution lawyers are affirming there, not really privacy, because marriage is by its nature a public act. That's part of what makes a marriage is that it's public. But you're invoking the right to privacy as why the state needs to accept this type of marriage, which seems to kind of contradict the actual nature of marriage if you think in that way. So it's on informational privacy. It started a little bit on genetic privacy. Like I was saying, it started a little more bioethical. On a few stories I was seeing about how much privacy people have, like we have for our genome and things like that. But as time went on, what happened is I realized that there was much more needed to kind of do a more foundational aspect of Catholic analysis of privacy in the sense of what can we take from privacy. So the thesis kind of has two parts in it. One part is basically looking at all these secular thinkers and analyzing them and saying, okay, what can we take from that and bring it into Catholic theology? And the other part is taking related principles from Catholic theology and seeing how they would apply to something of privacy, whether it's whatever kind of privacy you're talking about. But there's things like the seal of the confessional, the keeping of secrets, aspects like modesty and things like that. And so that's where the thesis is kind of coming from both directions, try and give a Catholic understanding based in theology on what we mean in informational privacy, so the Church can speak about it the next time that there's some story about how much data Facebook or Google is collecting on you, or some issue about HIPAA and they're debating a new version of HIPAA or something.
Excellent. Well, so who are some of the secular thinkers, for example, that you're kind of studying and drawing upon or responding to?
I've drawn on a whole bunch of them. The most common one is probably the one I draw on the most, and the only one who gets his own chapter is Alan Weston, who was a law professor at Columbia, who passed away relatively recently, in the last decade or so. And he really had a very good sense of what privacy means in the abstract, because even though he's a law professor, a lot of his works are like, what is privacy and why should we have laws about privacy? And then he would do other works that would then take that and be more practical application, in legal details, which was not the focus I took on him. And so he has a very good understanding of privacy on a number of aspects that are very powerful, even for Catholics. And sometimes it's like he gets almost to a Catholic way of analyzing, but then he because he's a secular thinker, he stops short of a full understanding. For example, one of his first chapters in his Privacy and Freedom, which is his kind of opus magnus, his main work, he does a sociological analysis of basically every culture in the world and says, okay, is there something common about privacy in every culture, or is it something just like totally culture conditioned? Because that's a legitimate question if you're thinking about questions of privacy. And so he goes to all these cultures, even cultures that people think, they have very little privacy, and shows no, they have certain things that are private, and shows it as a universal among cultures. Although at the same time, there are cultural aspects of it that vary a little bit culture to culture. Because he notes that like a few little things, such as the marital act, are always private in every single culture. But every other culture has other things that are private, but which of those things that are private varies a lot culture to culture. Mm-hmm. And so that's his first insight, really. Another thing he brings out is that as a lot of the other secular thinkers, like Cecilia Bach and others, focus a lot on the intrusion aspect, like when I get the information, and not just on what I do with that information after I get it. To give a simple example, all of us have our information in the DMV. It has our birth date, our social security number in the database, all those information in the DMV. And most of us don't have much of a problem with the DMV having that in a database as long as it's kept private. If that database all of a sudden became, on a publicly accessible website, all of us would scream, like there was intrusion into our privacy. Even though they already had that information, it's how they're using that information after they collected it. And so his idea, which is kind of like that is both the information as taken and the information as used. And I think these two we can appropriate as Catholics. We can say like, yes, because we look at it in these cultures, we can say it's universal. If we talk about it, we can talk about it as a control, like the definition I end up settling on is a control of information. In that sense, he doesn't use the exact word control, but it's more or less synonymous with what he's talking about in his definition. And so it's that aspect of the rational control of information, because if we go back just a step here, even when he's talking about all the different cultures, he also goes into these cultures that seem to be like super private. And he realized that some of them have aspects that they're unprivate about that other cultures are private about. So there is kind of this certain degree that varies a little bit, but all cultures have a mixture of private and public. That's really an interesting why we would talk about like a rational degree of control. Obviously, if you just say, if we talk about virtue ethics, rational is, the rational choice to do this or that. And rational is not an absolute, and it doesn't like immediately on its own just give you the answer to every question.
Right.
And it leaves a decent amount of gray area, but I think my work, at least right now, is much more foundational work. So leaving notable areas of gray areas of the exact application, I don't think is necessarily an issue at this point. Maybe later on I'll do another work and get into like some of those details more specifically. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of definition we're dealing with when we talk about the right to privacy, is how we control our information, and that's kind of based on Weston's definition, although it's not a direct quotation of his definition.
Well, now earlier you made reference to the church has its own areas that are similar to this, or has spoken and has thoughts on these same questions. Information. I know, for example, if I overheard a confession, I would be bound to the same seal that you are as a priest. What does the church have kind of in this area, and where does the church teach in these things?
So a certain amount of this is in the social encyclicals of the church, whereas talking about related rights that imply a right to privacy, like a lot of when they talk about like rights to secondary institutions, like the right to the family, in one of them it talks about the right to have a home, an individual home for your family, and not to have to be forced to share accommodations. But that's indicating a sense of privacy for the family, even though the term in the social encyclical is not privacy at that point. Mm-hmm. He's just talking about each family has the right to their own house, basically, or their own apartment of some form. Or other things like private property or human dignity that kind of touch on privacy. In Fratelli Tutti 42, Pope Francis is the first one to really affirm the right to privacy as a moral right in the magisterium, but he basically just says it exists and it's bad when we encroach on it. He doesn't really go into what is it. I had started my doctoral thesis before Fratelli Tutti was published, and I had thought, the question was, does the right to privacy exist in Catholic theology? And when this number from Fratelli Tutti comes out, it's like it changes from that to how do we understand it, even though does it exist? It was going to be 95%. How do we understand it?
Right.
Not just yes or no, does it exist? And that's from there. And then on the other side, you have a lot on, not necessarily as much on the magisterium, but a lot in kind of the great theologians on things like keeping secrets, or like you mentioned, the seal. And there's a whole development on, like professional secrets, and the idea is that a lot of those have very clear analogs with modern privacy, because somebody from some theologian from 100 years ago was talking about, well, in what cases does your doctor have to keep confidentiality of the patient? It's kind of professional confidentiality, and that and HIPAA would seem to have a very close correspondence. Obviously, there it's considered as a secret, not just as information that's because information when you're talking about privacy is often an implied secret. Like that I went in and I go and get my annual, physical, and I get the blood test, and they have that, and there's implied that there's an implied secret between me and the blood testing company and the doctor that you're not going to share this with the world. But it's not explicitly stated like it might have been to the doctor 100 years ago in the kind of things, although there was that professional secrecy there that kind of relates to those. So those are the kind of things from a Catholic perspective that I deal with a lot. It's kind of coming at it from both sides there.
Well, now you've come to speak at the fall conference, and you've kind of spoken about your dissertation. What was your paper about, and what were the other papers on your panel about together? I realize that's putting you on the spot. Were you paying attention?
So my paper was titled "Privacy in Catholicism's Deeper Sense of Human Dignity," because the conference here is on human dignity. So it was focusing on how the idea of human dignity can help us get from a Western definition of privacy, which I mentioned is very legal, to a much fuller definition was the first part. I kind of had 3 points. That was the first point. The second point was more about human dignity as far as the social encyclicals and how that, or even Gaudium et Spes, and how things like being Imago Dei speak to a sense of privacy. And the third part was an analysis of John Paul II's theology of the body, and talking about the difference in how modesty as a sense of privacy, and how even other forms of privacy, in the sense that before the fall we could all have perfect communion with everybody, whereas now to actually have communion we need some separating off of an us versus them, not in a bad way, but in the sense that this is our family. And this is our family tradition, and it's our little secret. And, it's and we're not telling the whole neighborhood. We're not, and those type of things, and how those are related, and because that is a sense of dignity that we have in this kind of in between the fall and the second coming, where we exist, at least for now.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll all be with Jesus in the second coming, but right now we're between the fall and the second coming. So, and the other two, one was talking about how we can look at the different kinds of moral theories, kind of an extension of MacIntyre in his After Virtue and Three Systems of Moral Inquiry. It was kind of an extension of that one, and talking about how to do it practically and how to engage practically on those type of things. And the third one was an analysis of internet use and internet addiction or problematic internet use, focusing on the internet itself and how the internet affects psychology and ethical choices and things, explicitly avoiding the specific content the person will look at, especially things like pornography addiction or video game addiction, which are forms of internet addiction, but are really directed more at the pornography or video games most of the time. So those are the other two presentations on my panel. I don't want to go into super detail because I have a good memory of them, but I don't have perfect memory.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that, that third paper was dealing with kind of internet and stuff, because this is how I know I first encountered you. Is you are relatively active on social media. And so perhaps as a priest, can you talk about your own presence on social media? How do you view it as a user, knowing that it can be something that can be very, very difficult for a lot of people?
Well, it was interesting for me because I started out not in the sense that I want to be the best on social media or anything. From 2006 to 2010, I was working out in the field as a religious brother in youth ministry. And towards the end of that, I started being on kind of the rewrite development team. So we were rewriting our youth ministry Conquest, which is kind of a Regnum Christi directed youth ministry. We were writing kind of the books and weekly activities and things. And along with that, I started having different thoughts about youth ministry and how we can do better with it in the U.S. And I started a very simple blog, and nobody was reading it, and asked a few people I know in real life, and they said, "Well, you got to put it on Facebook and Twitter." So I started a Facebook and Twitter account, when I was studying theology there, and then it just started taking off. The first big kind of bump was when Pope Benedict XVI resigned. I was one of the organizers of hashtag Thanks Pontifex, which was trending right at the end of the last day, the February 28th, when he was his last day as Pope. And so that was those type of things that was really what started bumping it up. And then it just kept being that, having that, being able to synthesize, the thought of this or that into a short message, a tweet. You can't. I managed to give a good Catholic perspective to people, and my view on that is it's meant to be kind of a support for people who are Catholic and have, So it's like, how do I live my faith in my everyday life? Whether it's a reflection from a spiritual author I tweet, or whether it's kind of like a moral analysis of an issue of the day. I don't think anything like that can replace, going to Mass in your parish and things. But I think a lot of times it can be a supplement for people throughout the week, so that, and I'm just thinking of an average professional guy, like my brother-in-law or somebody, he goes to Mass on Sunday, and then, the rest of the week he's like the IT manager at his job, and so if he sees a message on this story I heard about, here's the Catholic moral analysis in a way that's bite-sized so he can understand it, it can be helpful for him and things like that. And that's what I generally see it as, is kind of a way to kind of provide that kind of continuation for the people who often, due to work or life circumstances, can't, get to Mass every Sunday, but can't be at the church more often, even though they probably wish they could sometimes, and things.
Yeah.
To provide provide that combination, the moral analysis and even the spiritual authors, because I'll often tweet spiritual authors or reflections on, on the readings of the day or things, to kind of give that kind of daily life. Obviously, as I've gotten more into moral theology, it might have tended a little bit more that way, just because that's, like when I started it, I was like second year theology in the seminary, and now I'm writing a doctoral thesis in moral theology. So I realized my own Twitter, it's going to partially depend on what my everyday life is as well. It's not just kind of like existing there in the abstract. So I know that I do know that I've gotten more into the moral aspect, just because that's where other things in my life have led me, to do the doctoral thesis and things. So that's where I am at the moment. And I write regularly. I write articles pretty regularly, being in most of the major Catholic publications, from America, Crux, National Catholic Register, Aletheia, those type of things that. The ones, public discourse, which is, I guess, not Catholic, but kind of, it's not, it's
lots of Catholics are involved.
Judeo-Christian ethics.
Yeah.
So that's where, I think it's a way to get the kind of stuff we're talking about in this moral theology, but to synthesize it in a way that, my brother-in-law who's an IT manager, or somebody else in a similar situation, or my sister, his wife, who's, stay-at-home mom with her kids, can understand it and not feel overwhelmed, because I think, if I brought either of them to this conference, they would be overwhelmed,
Sure.
They're, like, my brother-in-law could probably, but if like the internet talk, because he would know, he knows he's an IT manager, but it's like, but like most of the talks, it would be above them, but it's trying to present the analysis in a way that hopefully is understandable to the average person, and sometimes that could be done in a tweet. Sometimes that takes, a 1,000 word article, and that's all over. That's where I write a lot of the articles. So
right. Wonderful. If somebody wanted to learn a little bit more, take a little deeper dive into some of the concepts of privacy and as you were talking, even the moral theology, what would be a resource or two that somebody could kind of read for that?
Yeah, so as a moral theology, there's a lot of different resources to start off with. I know as far as privacy within the church's teaching, there is very little. Part of what ended up with Father Nicanor Austriaco with the doctoral thesis was I had actually thought of my theme first and then looked for a director, which is not the most normal way to do a doctoral thesis, but that's how I did. That's how I was doing it. And I emailed him saying, hey, I was looking at this theme. And he said, oh, yeah, I wanted to do a new edition of my textbook. And I just looked through all the Catholic resources, whether it's different journals, and I found nothing on this topic. And it was a topic I wanted to add to my next edition of my bioethics textbook. So he's like, that's part of why he took it on, because it was a topic that he knew was needed. And unfortunately, there's not a ton out there. Matthew Shadle has written a few things. I've written a few things. If you search either of us for blogs and things, Matthew Shadle focuses on surveillance capitalism, which especially for a lot of the questions like Facebook and Google is very relevant. And so he's reasonably good with that. I have a few pieces more on privacy on my own blog, and and he has a few he had it on CatholicMoralTheology.com, I think was one, and another one on Church Life Journal. So those are kind of, and all of those are more specific issues, not privacy in general. Unfortunately, there's no kind of either academic or popular work that kind of talks about the right to informational privacy in Catholic theology or in a Catholic sense. And that's part of the reason I'm writing a doctoral thesis, because
there's nothing yet.
There's nothing yet.
Yeah.
And I don't know when the doctoral thesis will be published in a way that, for the average person. I know the plan is to hopefully defend it around Easter time of 2022, but I don't know as far as
turning it into a book.
Well, turning it into a book, and then there's almost like two different books. One would be kind of a 400-page version that I'd put through an academic publisher, and the other one would be like a 150-page version that I'd put through like Pauline or Ignatius or somebody like that, for a more popular audience. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of resources. We have a few kind of blog posts by myself or Matthew Shadle's, reasonably good too. but I haven't seen a ton more that's kind of out there, and especially that's accessible.
Well, if somebody wanted to follow you on social media, what is your Twitter handle? Is that the best place to follow you these days?
Well, I post the most on Twitter, but it depends where you are. If you're not on Twitter, I'm also on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. Those three, I generally keep up pretty consistently, and it's just Fr Matthew LC. So like Father Matthew, and then LC is for the Legionaries of Christ, my religious community. So that's what I've used as my handle, and it works on all three of those, which are, I think, the three most common social media people use,
sure,
especially for stuff like this. I'm not on TikTok or anything like that. I'm not.
Well, Father Matthew, thank you so much for coming to be with us at the Fall Conference, and thank you for your contribution to understanding these issues as church.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ken. I'm glad to be on. I hope that the Ethics Center here, the Nicholas Center, can do great things to help build the church and help people understand all the richness of the church's teaching.
Thank you to Father Matthew Schneider. Find links to his social media profiles and some of his writing in the show notes. Subscribe to Ethics and Culture Cast so that you can always get the latest episodes by visiting ethicscenter.nd.edu/podcast. We would love your feedback. Please review the show on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts, and email your suggestions to cecpodcast@nd.edu. Our theme music is I Dunno by Grapes, licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution License. We'll see you next time on Ethics and Culture Cast. Until then, make good decisions.